Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you guys are doing well, and it is thus far a little bit of a slower news day for the Seahawks. So I want to talk a little bit about one thing that Greg Bell dropped on Twitter late last night that kind of got me thinking. This isn't really news. This isn't really some shocking new revelation. This is just kind of the typical training camp hype that pretty much every team ever has built through their beat reporters. So I saw this, and I do acknowledge that just because this is being said about training camp doesn't mean it's going to translate all the way to the regular season. There are countless examples of teams doing something and often doing it well in training camp, and then the regular season comes around and it's like, whoa, okay, so much for that. I guess that didn't happen. Look at the Denver Broncos last year if you want a really good example of that. But Greg Bell caught my attention when he tweeted this out last night. The Seahawks are doing more and different screen pass drills with running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends alike than I've seen in all the other Pete Carroll camps combined. So that's a pretty bold proclamation, and I don't know if Greg Bell is counting how many different screen passes he sees in each training camp, but the fact that he would say something like that means it must be a very stark contrast. We're doing more things with the screen game than we have in recent history, really, because Carroll's been here a very long time now. So I see this, and it makes me think about an article that Field Goals posted last season, right near the end of the year. Here it is, right near the end of the year, actually, as well as the season. So this was right after we lost to the Niners in week 16. Yeah, week 16. And we, at that point, were a historically bad team throwing screens. And this article kind of lays it all out. So I'm going to pull this up real quick. There are a couple of PFF charts that I really want to hammer home here. So you have this one right here. Let me zoom in just a little bit. So this is a chart for success rate when running a screen. And it's also the x-axis, the x-axis is how often you run a screen. The y-axis is how often that screen succeeds. Now, the Seahawks didn't run very many screens. It's about like 6.2%. Only the Saints ran fewer screens. But there is a cataclysmic difference between the Seahawks' success rate and the success rate of the second lowest team. Literally half. Full half. The Seahawks were successful in about 13% of their screenplays last year. The Dolphins, 26-27. So literally, the Seahawks' success rate on screens was approximately half that of the next lowest team. And you have some teams up here that are successful on more than half of their screens. We're just trying to be successful on 1/6 of our screens. So not only were we the worst this season, we were the worst probably in many recent seasons combined. You could probably compile the last 10 years of data from every NFL team. We would be right down there. So I don't think people needed to see a chart to know we were bad at running screens, but hopefully this chart will really hammer that home. And by the way, just in case you want to have a little bit of fun, you can also see that we're also really bad against defending screens. Maybe that's why we're so bad at running them in game, because the team we practice against is really bad at defending them. But anyway, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about our ability to run screens. Over the Carroll era, we have never really been a team that runs a lot of screens, right? Ever since Carroll got here, and then Wilson got here, and Bevel got here, it's been a very, very muted part of our offense. There were a few years where Marshawn Lynch would actually catch screens and do pretty good things with them. It was never a huge part of the offense, but it was there. But overall, we have not been a very screen-happy team. And over the years, people have said, hey, it's the offensive coordinator. We've swapped out offensive coordinators twice. It hasn't changed that much. And then some people say, well, it's Wilson. Well, we swap out Wilson, and we had this. Like you see the screen? This is without Russell Wilson. Not that Wilson was very good at running screens over in Denver either, by the way. He's down here in like the bottom 7. So Maybe he wasn't very good at running screens, but point is, even after moving on from Wilson and going to a new quarterback, still can't run screens. So, what's going on here? Is this just a long, extended coincidence of seasons where no matter what the personnel, the coaches, the quarterback, the receivers, the running backs, the tight ends are, you're just not really a big screen team? Is this a Pete Carroll thing? I mean, he is kind of the lone stable element of this equation, right? He is the one guy who hasn't changed where he's changed the way he I'm sorry, excuse me, who hasn't changed his position, right? He's been at the head coach position the whole time. But here's the question. With the knowledge that we're supposedly practicing more screens and doing different screens this year, with the knowledge that this is now year 3 of the Waldron offense, with all these things going into it, is this the year we start to turn it around and actually become a respectable screen team? Well, when thinking about the Seahawks' inability to run screen passes in recent years, I do think that you have to at least somewhat look at the personnel, even though we've seen the personnel swap in and out over the years and it not get that much better. But when your most prolific receiver in terms of catches per game is somebody like a Tyler Lockett, who is not going to fight for extra yardage, who basically has given up the yard after the catch part of his game to preserve his career and be able to play longer, kind of makes sense that your screen game would suffer. That's not a guy you can throw screens to, because if he's not willing to fight for extra yardage, if that's not part of his game, if that's not something he's going to be able to do, it's tough, right? Maybe when he was younger and had a little more lateral agility and a little more elusiveness, sure, but Lockett, not really a guy you can count on to be part of a screen game anymore. And he's not big enough to be a great blocker, too, so that creates some of the problem there. We've had some running backs that they can catch the ball some, but it's not a prolific part of their game. Guys like Chris Carson, Rashad Penny, K9, supposedly he can do it, but he hasn't really shown it that much yet. He showed it a little bit last year, but in college he barely ever caught the ball. They say he can do it, but we haven't really seen it yet. So put all that together, and it makes a little bit of sense why the screen game would have been so bad in recent years. Now, we do have one receiver on this team, or we did have one receiver on this team in previous years, who was a yard after the catch threat because of his ability to break tackles and his ability to outrun defenders at the same time, DK Metcalf. A combination of speed and strength that, quite frankly, should result in a lot of good yard after the catch opportunities. Yet, we didn't really use him that much on screens in the most recent couple of seasons, I feel like. And I don't know exactly why that is. Maybe they just took that stuff out of the playbook because they realized Lockett was going to be completely useless in those situations. I don't know. But Metcalf is one guy you look at and you go, yeah, he could be an effective screen receiver if you used him that way. But last year, even with Metcalf, one element of this, and this is one thing this Field Goals article goes into, is that the Seahawks receivers, and I believe it's receivers as a whole, were second to last in the entire NFL in yards after the catch. Only the Falcons had fewer yards after the catch. So our guys would catch the ball and they wouldn't get a whole lot more after it. And that is, of course, the essence of a screen game. When you're running screens, pretty much all of your yards, sometimes even all of your yards, literally come after the catch. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the guys that are being added to the offense in 2023 and see how much they might be able to help. Zach Charbonnet, very prolific receiver these last 2 years. Over his final 2 seasons in college football at UCLA, he played 22 games and he caught 61 passes. So he was a big part of that passing attack, just under 3 catches a game. And you watch, most of his catches, almost all of his catches, are out of the backfield. They're in the flat. They're just, he runs up the gut without the ball, turns around, catches the ball 2 yards from the line of scrimmage. They're pretty much all dump-offs and check-downs and safety valve type plays. So those are screens. And yes, he was acting as an emergency option for the quarterback if he can't find something down the field, but there is a reason why he's being put in those situations. He's got good hands, and he can run players over after the catch, which is, of course, a big part of running back screens. So if you're looking for a guy to just catch short passes when the deep stuff doesn't develop, Charbonnet can be your guy. Then you have a guy like Kenny McIntosh, who was also very productive catching balls over his Georgia career. Actually, over the last 2 seasons, if you combine basically the 2 seasons he was a prolific part of the offense, he had 65 catches, which was one of the highest totals for any Georgia player. Now, he gets his damage done differently. Sometimes he lines out wide. Sometimes he runs routes down the field. Sometimes he's doing wheel routes. It's not like Charbonnet. He's doing things a little more with a little more diversity, but he is still doing plenty of screen stuff. He is still catching a lot of dump offs and checkdowns. He's still catching a lot of planned screen passes where he's supposed to read blockers and move up the field. He sometimes lines up as a receiver and catches the wide receiver screen effectively, even though he's not technically a wide receiver. He lines up as one. So there's definitely something here that we haven't had that much of recently. Like CJ Procise kind of had that, but he just couldn't stay on the field. And then you also have JSN. I want to take a look at a couple things with JSN, probably the biggest new addition to this offense in this area. First of all, just on the very basic level, 2021, the one full season he had in college football, almost half of his yards that he gained were yards after the catch. Just under half. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a ton in terms of like, oh, that means he ran a ton of screens. Of course not. But it shows that he does have the ability to make things happen after the catch. But here's something that I found on a fantasy football website. First, I want to highlight the fact that JSN ran 414 routes last season on passing plays. And this article on 4for4.com has these two charts. JSN ran a screenplay on 4.8% of his routes, so basically 5%, and his success rate on those routes was 100. So you put those two things together, you have a pretty... it's not a massive part of his game. It's not the main thing he's bringing to the table. I mean, he's a wide receiver. What kind of wide receiver runs screen passes more than anything else? But 5% of 414 passing plays, you're looking at about 20. You're looking at about 20 screen plays that JSN ran, and all of them were successful. So that is more than one a game because JSN played in a grand total of, 13 games that year. He played in 13 games that year, so you're looking at 20 screen passes, all of them run successfully by him. That's 1.5 a game. So that's a pretty significant part of an offense. I know it doesn't sound like much, but how often do you think you're going to be running a screenplay? If you look at this chart, you'll see that even the top team ran the screen about 18%. So if you're running screens to JSN even 1.5 times a game, that's a decent portion of your screen diet because you know a lot of those screens are going to be checkdowns and dump offs where you look deep and then the pressure got there and you were like, oh, I got to get it out of my hand real quick. Here, take it, Charbonnet. Go get 3 yards. So if you run wide receiver screens with JSN even just once a game, that is significant. It's kind of like the idea of the fly sweep that we keep waiting to be part of this offense. Now, I don't think fly sweeps are really going to be part of JSN's game. I don't think that's really what he does. But if you take a look at it from the perspective of we're just trying to make progress, adding a guy like a JSN who can contribute very positively as a screen receiver, then it's every little bit helps, right? Because obviously when you're thinking about screens, most of the time it is going to be to a back. It is going to be a check down. Sometimes it's going to be a planned screenplay where you let the pass rushers get upfield and then you just throw it behind them to a running back and then he follows the blockers down the field. But if you can start incorporating wide receiver screens effectively, because I remember back in the day with Jermaine Kearse, we would try to run the bubble screen. That's what they call it sometimes, the bubble screen, and it never went anywhere. He just couldn't do anything with it. But JSN seems like he's somebody who can do something with it. He's a guy who can make things happen after the catch, broke a lot of tackles, made a lot of guys miss in college, and we have a track record of him being able to do it. Not a ton, but a pretty substantial amount of OSU's offense this year was that. So those 3 things means you should be able to start unleashing a screen game in 2023. See you guys later. Go Hawks.